Ready?
Welcome back, everyone, to a new episode of Red Flags, Green Flags, Modern Psychology for Everyday Drama. In Season 2, we are focusing on work relationships, specifically looking at red and green flags in the workplace. As most of our time is consumed by our job or profession, workplace drama is an inescapable part of everyday life. Building strong and positive relationships at work is critical to your career success, but also to your well-being. However, it's not always easy to build strong relationships with colleagues or bosses, as emotions, personal interests, and just downright bad behavior can pollute that interpersonal space. The aim of this season is to help you better understand the drama that happens at work and to provide you deep insights to why people behave the way they do. Also, we will discuss different strategies on how to deal with workplace drama, from working with difficult colleagues and managers to surviving toxic work environments. By using a psychological lens to interpret real-life experiences at work, we can gain better insight on how best to navigate the complexity of a modern workplace. The startup field is one of the strongest drivers of economic growth globally, and working for a startup can be such a thrill. Being an entrepreneur is by no means a profession for everyone. It requires a different mindset, sometimes even different ways of working, and a huge amount of risk-taking, grit, and perseverance to succeed as an entrepreneur. While creating a new business is an exciting endeavor with promises of high returns, it can also be a breeding ground for toxic behaviors and mismanagement in the workplace. Great entrepreneurs are not always great leaders or team players. This podcast will talk about the intricacies of the startup world and the challenges of working in such a high-pressured and fast-paced environment. What are the red flags and green flags to look out for, and what advice would you give to people working in this startup field? And so joining me on my podcast to talk about how to succeed as an entrepreneur and identify these red flags in the startup field is LouLou Khazen, a true startup veteran with over 10 years of experience in the startup field, having invested in various startups herself and also successfully launched and sold her own company. LouLou, what a pleasure to have you here. Welcome to the show. Great to have you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm very excited to be here.
Super. And we've known each other for quite a while, since
Yes.
2016 or 2017. And back then you were already, a success, and people know about you here in Dubai, especially in the startup field. And so maybe before we kick off this show, maybe you can tell the audience a little bit more about yourself and what you do.
Sure. So I've been in Dubai for 20 years. I pretty much started my career here. I worked in the corporate world for around 6 or 7 years. And then after the financial crisis in 2008, I lost my job. And that was the first time I thought about entrepreneurship as an option for me. I thought I wanted to create my own destiny. I wasn't going to wait for someone to employ me. So serendipity made it that I meet an investment banker who also had just left her job at a very big investment bank here, and she wanted to start a startup advisory firm. So I joined her, and that was like my foray into entrepreneurship. So this is back in 2009. I did that for 2 years till 2011, and then I decided to launch my own company. So I embarked on Netbish, which is the first and the largest online marketplace for freelancers across the Middle East and North Africa region. Grew the business over 8 years, raised $2 million, had a very nice, small but high impact team. Been through all the dramas and ups and downs, anything you can imagine I've been through until we sold the company in 2020. In 2019, I started investing in startups with a small group of friends, and that group has grown over the years. We're currently a 200 plus investor network. We call ourselves Spade Ventures. I lead this group, and we invest in early stage tech companies.
Like an angel investor or...
So we call ourselves a syndicate. So we're pretty much a group of investors. But okay. Because we pool our money together, instead of me doing $20,000 on my own, we bring in a group of people, and we end up investing anywhere from $500,000 to $2 million in startups.
Because you're working as a group together on that investment.
Yes, so
Amazing.
We pool all the money, we form like a legal entity, and then we invest in the startup. And we call this a syndicate.
Amazing. Great career. Great career path you've had so
Thank
far.
you. I also have a podcast, actually.
Yeah,
I forgot to.
I've been on your podcast.
Yes, yes. So the podcast is, I think, an extension of everything I do. It's a way for me to give back and actually to bring some amazing guests as well, to share insights, something that is more casual and unscripted and hopefully more genuine as well. So I think I was hit by the entrepreneurship bug probably around 2010. I was still in Dubai. I was in Dubai, and basically there were two companies, one called Abraj, which obviously went bust now, we all know about it, and then Wamda, which was another company. They did this huge entrepreneurship event back in November 2010, and they invited entrepreneurs from all over the region and the world. I think there were probably around 2,000 people. And this was the first time I kind of felt the energy of entrepreneurs and met so many of them building and creating. And once you meet people who are doers, who are, the men and the women in the arena who are taking risks and building great things, you just fall in love with these people. And
different
honestly,
energy also, right? Yeah.
I caught that bug, and I thought, this is what I want to be. These are the types of people that I want to be around. I feed off their energy, and they feed off mine, and I just love, everything that they do, the risks that they take, the personal challenges, the growth that they go through, everything that they do. I find it very fascinating.
Amazing. And so you also have that corporate background, and so maybe you can explain a little bit, where do you see that difference? Because you said I caught the entrepreneur bug.
Yes.
But what would you say kind of like the biggest differences are with working in a corporate environment?
Well, it's been a while since I've worked in a corporate environment, but I can tell you that I think it's completely different. When you're an entrepreneur, you're building something. First of all, you're building it for yourself, and you're solving a very big problem, and it's very personal. So no matter how much people tell you that, it's not personal, it is personal, because you're driving this thing. It's your vision. It's where you want to take it. And when you are working in a startup, everybody on the team should, in a way, have that same mission, right? Everybody, we talk a lot about being mission driven. So everybody is bought into this mission, and they wanna accomplish that. So the level of commitment and loyalty and energy is completely different. In the corporate world, I think it's slightly different environment, right? You are a number in a large company at the end of the day.
With a cubicle.
With a cubicle or with a corner office, right? It doesn't matter. But ultimately, I just always say, like, you're in entrepreneurship, you're very indispensable when you're in a startup. In a corporate life, I think you're quite dispensable. So I don't know if you can have the same level of loyalty and commitment and all-in type mentality when you're in a corporate job. And I don't want to generalize, because I know that there are some industries that work really, really hard. Others maybe not so much. So it's not it's not the same. I don't want to have a blanket statement, but I feel that it's a completely different energy. In the corporate world, you're after that promotion, right? That's like the end game.
Right.
In the corporate world, you have a certain framework that you operate within. You have a certain job. The bigger the corporate, obviously, the higher the bureaucracy. So your job is even more
narrowly defined. Yeah.
Exactly. So you can't really do much outside of these boundaries.
Right.
So it's completely different than working in a startup environment where you have to roll your sleeves and do a bit of everything, and the opportunity to grow and learn.
Pulling up the boxes with everyone else, right, in the company. And
you do everything, right, in a startup, especially in the early days. When the startup is still under, let's say, 50 or 100 employees,
right,
you have to be a kind of a generalist, at least at the beginning,
yeah,
because you have to do a lot of things and not say, oh no, this doesn't fall in my domain, or no, this is not part of my job description, which is something that you see a lot in the corporate world.
The corporate world, yeah. Makes a lot of sense. And I guess I also personally love that kind of startup environment, because it's, I'm also someone who's like a risk taker. I like the creativity of it. I love the energy that you see in a startup environment. But at the same time, I can imagine, especially when you're, like you said, you're so devoted. There's a lot of loyalty and commitment, especially by the founders of the organization. They give their heart and soul. When I look at a lot of startups, like they're living very bootstrapped, very lean. They're living off their moms and dads' couches still, like not paying any rent so that they can kind of survive. And sometimes even the investors, they want that from their from their founders. But you can also imagine when you start to grow that business, that not everyone shares the same kind of commitment or maybe the same kind of loyalty that the founders do. And do you see that happen a lot as well? And how do you see that manifest in the organization?
It's very important that the founders are actively involved in the interviewing process and the hiring process of the first 100 or even 200 people. I think having that culture fit is very important in startups. In startups, I know that people talk a lot about work-life balance and all of that, but I think realistically in startups, it's very difficult to have that. And the expectation is that everybody is so committed that you will do whatever needs to be done, whatever it takes to make it happen, because startups have a lot of, they live by a sense of urgency.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, if two bad moves and then you could be dead. So there's always that sense of urgency, and people are expected to do what is necessary to make things happen. So is that fair? I mean, is that the question? I mean, as you begin to scale the startup, maybe people won't have the same kind of loyalty or commitment.
That's what I can imagine. I can imagine that eventually, you hire people in and they're like, I just want to do my job. I want to make money, and I don't feel that commitment. And then you might have like a CEO or one of the co-founders like, no, come on, we have to work at it. We have to put in the extra hours. We have to make this work. So I can imagine that can cause some friction in the organization with employees.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, again, if the startup has scaled to a certain extent, and then people are not extremely critical, and there's no like single point of failure. So if Ali doesn't do his job well, it means there's a big problem. Then I guess maybe founders can start to tolerate some of that. But the environment around you, the people that you see around you, you will feel that you are slacking off. Like if you don't give it all, and if you don't put everything in, you will still feel that you are behind vis-a-vis your colleagues.
Right.
So maybe you might not feel as good about it, and you might decide to leave. You might say, this is not the right environment for me.
Right.
But again, I think it's...
So just jumping in there, so do you see a lot of turnover in startups? Do a lot of people there's a lot of attrition that happens, a lot of hiring and firing?
So, there's this thing in startup land that says... hire slow and fire fast, right? So I think if it's not working, the founders don't have the time or the resources to help someone get to where they need to be. People need to come in, and they need to be plugged in like from day one.
Right.
So I don't think they have the luxury to sort of invest and grow grow people. Again, as the startup scales and it's bigger, then probably they might have a bit more time. But in the early days, it's not the case. So I think you will feel that you are behind, and you might think that this is not the right environment for me, and decide to leave.
Right. And so talking about talent and people that do well in organization, what kind of people flourish like in startup environments, and like does someone have like the X factor when you see? Maybe there's two separate questions. So I think one, what kind of people flourish in those kinds of environments? And then number two is like when you see, because you invest in companies, can you see when someone has the X factor, and what is that? So those are kind of two questions.
So when you talk about flourish in startup environment, you mean as an employee of a startup, or as a founder? As an employee. I think people who take initiative, people who can work autonomously, are very, very important in a startup. People who are accountable for their work, because when something needs to be done, it needs to be done, right? So no one has to double check and triple check on you, because no one has the time or the resources. So you need to be very accountable. If you if you like getting your hands dirty, basically, and multitasking or serial tasking, so not necessarily doing many things at the same time, but doing things, switching, let's say, tasks and doing things like that, then obviously you would flourish. Again, especially in the early days of a startup. You need to have energy, like physically. You need to be, I think, in a good physical state, because it requires a lot of energy.
And mental state as well, right?
And mental state. I mean, you need to love drama, because I always say, like, I'm addicted to startups, because the highs are high and the lows are pretty low. And some people just like that. You function like this. Some people like more of a stable environment and something that's more predictable. In startups, you're working with ambiguity the whole time. You don't know what's coming right behind the corner. So people who are able to work in an ambiguous environment as well, people who, again, can take their own initiative and not wait for directions. Creativity, I think, is very important as well, because you constantly need to find solutions with very limited resources. So you have to get very, very creative.
So maybe before we jump into the X factor question, maybe I want to kind of go back into the drama aspect. What's some of the drama that you then see
in startups?
Yeah, in startups specifically.
I think drama is basically when people are not, pulling their weight, and I think it just, frustrates people around them. Drama is also happens when there is a lot of, when people are distracted by small talk or things that are not very important. I think it also creates drama, because you're trying to get somewhere, and then there's all this noise around you. So I think you need to stay really, really focused.
But maybe some specific examples, like things that you can think of that you do see like as a common thing that happens in many different startups, because maybe being in that high pressure environment, or when the stakes are so high, or like the urgency is there, you can imagine that can cause friction sometimes. And like you said, you have to have thick skin to be able to deal with that, but not everyone has that. And how does that play out then, for example? What are some things that
I think what I've seen usually has to do with founder dynamics, right? So this is where the major drama happens, and that could sometimes kill a startup. If the founders are not aligned on the vision, if the roles are not properly defined between, what are their responsibilities and who is accountable for what, I think that could lead to a lot of problems. Something, I personally face is that initially, when you want to co-found a company with someone, you need to have some difficult discussions, right? And talk about that divorce. Like, what does it look like if we disagree? And sometimes you want to avoid having these difficult, discussions as you're on your honeymoon. So I think having these difficult discussions is very important. And if you don't, this could lead to problems later on. So the drama that I've seen is mostly at that high level. It's either founder dynamics or potentially founder and investor dynamics. So when the investor's interests and the founder's interests are not aligned.
Misaligned.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of, I think on the employee level, I guess it's like standard across the board. Like I said, small talk or people not doing what they're supposed to do and letting their teams down. I guess things like that. I can't think of something very, very specific to startups.
Yeah, I love how you mentioned about the founder dynamics. I think that's very interesting, because you can see, for example, founders that are, they initially start with this purpose mode of like, let's make this work. We're going to change the world, right? That's how a lot of startup, entrepreneurs, they get into that business. But then they're put into the reality of things, and then you can start to see that their get together is not that aligned as they initially thought. And I can imagine that also sometimes plays out down below, right? Because you have people that you work with, and then you sit together with them, and you might say, well, I'm not so happy with my co-founder. I just actually don't want to work with him or her anymore. And so that is something that I think is really interesting that, a lot of people don't think about. And what are, you know, what are maybe some examples of specific examples of that, and what would you then say you could do to overcome some of that, or what could you do to kind of minimize the impact of, besides of course having the divorce discussion before you get into the divorce? It's better to see if you can resolve things. So maybe you can provide some insights there.
I mean, I think like any relationship, right? I think communication is very important. Setting and managing expectations are very important. And going back to your questions about specific examples of drama, when, let's say, the founders disagree and then everybody on the team knows about it. I mean, I think that, you know, the professional thing and the prudent thing is not to talk about it in front of everybody, because people might take sides. And this will cause a lot of, again, distraction and toxicity probably in the work environment.
You've had your own startup, right? So you can, you know, from your own perspective, but also you're looking at it from an outsider perspective. And I'd love to hear, like, what have you seen, kind of like the details in those examples?
I mean, I can share my own experience.
Yeah, please do. Please do.
I had a startup, and for a period of time I had a co-founder, and things didn't go well. And things didn't go well for exactly the reasons that I've explained. I mean, we failed to have a difficult conversation at the beginning. The equity, the shareholding split wasn't done properly, and this is all learning that you get later on. Even though, you know, the lines were kind of drawn in terms of like complementary skills, but there were some personal incentives as well that I didn't think about, you know, when we formed this partnership. So, for example, sometimes you might get a technical co-founder, and you think, okay, that they are going to take care of the technical thing, and then you find out later that actually their incentive or their wish is for them to be like a CEO, not to be a technical co-founder. So I think
personal interests. In this
exactly.
Case.
So understanding the motives basically behind you know, this marriage that is happening are very important. Why are you in this? You know, why do you want to build this business with me? What's in it for you? Where do you see yourself in the next 5 years in this business? What kind of role do you want to have? I think these are like very, very important discussions to have. And if you fail to have these discussions, it's a nightmare. It's a nightmare, because then you are in the middle of building, and you have 100 fires that you're trying to put out, and you're trying to fundraise, and you're trying to talk to your investors, and you're trying to hire people. And then at the same time, you have all that fighting that is happening with your co-founder, and that could really literally kill the startup and kill the company.
Could you maybe give an example of how that fighting played out in your organization?
Are we talking about my case, or are we talking how the fighting played out? It played out not publicly, I would say, but we were a small team. I mean, that was like in the early phases of Nabish, of the company. So we were a relatively small team. So yeah, people could see obviously that there was tension. It wasn't pleasant. I mean, that's all I can tell you. We weren't screaming and shouting at each other, but we had major differences in how we wanted to run things and what our roles were in the company. So that ultimately led to a divorce, and an ugly one.
Oof. And how many people did you have working in the organization at that time?
At the time, probably around 6 or 7.
How did it impact them?
Very badly. So a lot of people left. So the people, so the co-founder, she had technical, like she was a technical person. So a lot of people end up leaving when she left. So I had to pretty much rebuild the whole tech team. It was very, very challenging.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so the tech team left because she was the head of tech. And,
yes.
And so they all went with her.
Yes.
So it's also kind of political in a sense as well.
Probably you could say so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's challenging.
You could say so. Yeah. It wasn't, like I said, it wasn't an easy phase, but again, a lot of learning out of that phase.
Beautiful. What was something you learned about yourself? I know I'm getting personal, but what was something that you, when you reflect back, you say, because now you're so much further, of course.
Yeah.
But when you reflect back, what was the thing that you learned most about yourself?
I'm going to say something very cliche now, but what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Yeah.
I just learned that even though, again, having those difficult conversations might not be comfortable, sometimes you need to step into the uncomfortable and have these discussions that are perfectly normal, by the way. But I think for us, like as Arabs, like culturally, you're not super confrontational, and especially as an Arab woman, like culturally, it's not something that we are raised to do. So I think maybe that's why a lot of us tend to kind of avoid these difficult conversations and think that things are gonna play out, and you stay in that honeymoon phase, at least in your head, until things hit the wall.
No, it's an interesting topic, and maybe we can build upon that. I would love to know more about, what are some of the challenges maybe that women face, not specifically just here in the region, but as an entrepreneur, and especially working in a tech environment. Are there any specific challenges that you've identified, either for yourself or maybe you've seen around with the companies that you've invested in?
I think there aren't a lot of women entrepreneurs to start off with. I believe it's a factor of two things: culture and expectations. So, culturally, the woman is meant to be the caretaker in the home. I mean, again, I'm talking about our part of the world here. You're meant to be, having kids and growing a family and building a family, etc. And if you have a job, it's like a simple thing that you can do just to earn a bit of pocket money and kill some time.
So it's not taken seriously then.
Exactly. So the expectation, I feel, on women is not that high in terms of where they go in their careers. Now, again, things are changing, but when I was building this company 10 years ago, it was that's how it was, and I do believe it still is this way in a lot of countries in this part of the world. And the Emirates is not really a typical Arab country because you have a huge expat community.
It's very westernized,
Yeah. So I think culturally, probably it's still unacceptable for a woman to be in such a hardcore, high-pressure, demanding environment, because obviously that's going to take time away from, the husband and the family, and maybe she's taking care of like an elderly or something like that. I know that women here, they have a lot of caretaking roles. So it's probably one of the reasons why they don't get into it. And the other reason is, I think, women in STEM. Obviously, there's so many initiatives about women in STEM trying to get women interested in these types of topics, because traditionally they're not. So things are changing, but I do feel that there are like structural challenges that kind of prevent women from going into these hardcore environment.
Right.
I mean, again, if a woman also wants to start her own family, there's a whole set of challenges that will come as well, right? I mean, I've heard stories of investors speaking to women who are pregnant or who have just had a baby, and they would ask the woman, how are you going to run a business and you have a baby?
So
obviously,
there's even bias, maybe.
This is a question that they would never ask a man, right? So I think that the expectation is that your primary role is to take care of your family and your kids. So what are you doing here, building this startup? So I think it's tough. There's a lot of biases,
Can I ask you then, because you have a wonderful family.
Yeah.
You have 2 kids, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Wonderful husband. How did you make it work?
I didn't have kids initially. So when I was working on NetBish, it was so going back to the kind of the all-in mentality. I was all in. It was everything that I wanted to do. I wasn't interested in starting a family. But again, I don't want people I don't want people to think that this is the norm, right? Because you can have a family, but I can't share that experience because I was fully focused on building the startup, and then I had family later on. So I can't talk much about personal experience on that front.
Okay. Oh no, thank you for sharing that. I mean,
Yeah.
again, I know you do great in your field, and you've also got wonderful kids, and you've got a great family together, and so it's interesting because I think a lot of people, a lot of my listeners are women,
Yeah.
and so a lot of them are professionals and they
Yeah.
work, and some of them probably also are entrepreneurs as well. So it's great for them to get that insight, to also understand that there are very specific challenges to that. Even when you said working with investors, right, that even investor bias can maybe come into play, and those are things that you need to think about when you're actually sitting in front of investors and having that discussion with them.
Yes, I mean,
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
honestly, this question is unacceptable, but it does get asked in this part of the world. So basically, you have kids, and how are you gonna work on this company? How are you gonna have the time?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen. Actually, I have a friend of mine who had kids while she was building her startup, and she kind of went the opposite way in the sense that she had the baby, and then like 3 days later she was working again.
Wow.
So that's also not like the
standard.
the standard or how it should be.
Yeah.
But look, in reality, it's hard. Like startups are really hard. They're very demanding. So if you get into a startup, you need to know that work-life balance is something that's going to be very hard to achieve, especially in the early days. As much as people talk about it, and if I say this, I said this on LinkedIn once, and people were attacking me left, right, and center, talking about mental health and all of this. This is what it is.
It is what it is, right? Yeah.
I mean, you like it or you don't like it. It's your opinion. But if you want to build a successful company, it takes a lot of sacrifice.
Yeah. It's interesting that you talk about mental health and about, specifically around that commitment that you need to have and how hard it is. Looking, for example, at Gen Z, right, the generation now, the youngest generation in the workforce, and I think that it goes for a lot of generations, especially after the pandemic. Our perception to work has changed significantly. People want to have a work-life balance. They want to care for a pet and take care of, of their parent, or maybe having a family. And, so I think work, whereas prior to the pandemic, and it was becoming probably less and less, is having less of a stage of priority in their lives. And when I speak to a lot of people, right, I speak to a lot of companies, a lot of organizations, even government institutions, and the people that I engage with from that, maybe from an HR perspective, they say, well, look, Ali, what do I do? I'm dealing with so many employees that don't want to work anymore. They're burnt out. They don't have that resilience and stamina anymore, and that would not fit within the startup environment. And so what would you say that, for young entrepreneurs, have you seen any challenges for them specifically, setting up a business and their work commitment? Do you feel that that's different than older generations, or is it exactly the same?
I think, it's pretty challenging for a young entrepreneur. Now, they do have the energy, that's for sure. They do have the naivete, basically, that sometimes you need to actually start something that's completely bold and different and unique, and that is going to take a huge chunk of your life and energy. But also, I think the challenge for young entrepreneurs is they don't have the experience that older entrepreneurs have, because when you're a young entrepreneur and you're trying to build a team and hire people, managing these people, creating the right motivation for them is not easy, right, for someone who's just graduated to do. I think it takes someone with experience to be able to do that. Now, of course, you have outliers, right? Mark Zuckerberg started Facebook from university. So yes, of course, there are people that can make it, but typically the best age for entrepreneurship is in the 40s.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah. Once you've had like enough work experience,
wow.
and you are at a point where you're either like a subject matter expert, or you've accumulated a lot of experiences. You've probably managed people in your career at some point. So that's the best time basically to go and start a company.
Interesting. You'd have this idea that you should start young when you're an entrepreneur. But
no, really, I wouldn't encourage it. I would encourage, instead of building your own business, I would encourage young people to work at a startup, to feel what it's like to work your butt off, basically,
to have that experience.
because that's so important. But to go and build your own business, I feel it's very hard, very, very hard.
And so, when we bring this back to like CEOs and founder mentality, and and the impact that they have in the organization, how do you look at ego? Because I can imagine that a lot of these CEOs and founders, they've got a lot of ego. They're kind of like, I know it all, and everyone has to do it my way. And have you experienced that? Have you seen that?
Yes and no, because entrepreneurs, they need to have very, very thick skin, and they will hear a lot of no's along the way. You might be trying to get a co-founder who would say no. You might be trying to hire someone that you really admire and you really want part of your team, and they might say no. You go fundraising and you get a lot of no's. I mean, so many entrepreneurs, they have to meet 50, 60, 100 investors sometimes to be able to get that first check. So I don't think there's a place for ego in entrepreneurship now. Of course, maybe, again, sometimes we look at the outliers. We look at Elon Musk and Steve Jobs and all these like great one-of-a-kind leaders, and they obviously have very, very big personalities. And we think all entrepreneurs are like this. I don't think so.
It's like a bias, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. I don't think so. You actually have to be very humble and kind of very self-aware to be an entrepreneur. Of course, you need to have your vision and your values, and you need to stick to those. But it doesn't mean that you have an ego. It means that you know what you want and you know where you want to get to.
Right.
And sometimes having 100 people telling you their opinion is actually detrimental to you. So you need to know what is important for you and stick to that as guiding principles.
As guiding principles,
And then have, of course, some wiggle room for input from people that you care about and that you admire.
So maybe this is another segue question to this one. And when of course in my own field, in my experience working with entrepreneurs, and I'm a board member of many different kinds of startups, but also from the research perspective, right? And so when we try to figure out what are those characteristics that are common characteristics among successful entrepreneurs, so researchers try to figure that out so you can give advice on that. And when
narcissistic.
Narcissism comes up. Yeah, it does. And
delusional,
stubborn. But also you see a lot of people that often have ADHD or autism that are actually very successful. Right, they're very successful in the field of entrepreneurship, and because of their neurodiversity that they bring to the table. And now, if you go to Silicon Valley, for example, and you see a lot of the tech stars, let's say, some of them are not, maybe they don't have great social skills, but they're great at the job what they do. And so, how does that play out? How does that play out? Because you're a co-founder, you're a CTO. You're great at what you do, but you're not really great at, social skills, but you still need to lead people. And I've heard stories, like I've heard when I ask questions, and I do this class on political, organizational politics. And one specific story came up about a CTO that really didn't have that not EQ, right, emotional intelligence, or that political astuteness, to which then eventually, there were people that they hired and they ganged up against them, to which at the end the CTO left, which is such a sad story. So how, what would you advise, or what have you seen, or what could you advise in terms of how to make the workplace more accessible for people that are neurodivergent, and that have a different way of thinking? And because I can imagine that startups, it's not that kind of typical mindset. You need to be different, as you mentioned. You need to have that thicker skin. And so that neurodiversity is very common in such environments. And what's your advice there? What observations and advice? I'd love to hear from you on that one.
I mean, so sometimes, promoting somebody to a role that they're not equipped to have is not good for them, right? So I know that everybody wants that promotion, but sometimes if someone is a great engineer, they could be a very bad manager. So maybe they're better off being a great engineer, getting a higher pay, more stock in the startup, for example, and being rewarded for the great work that they do. Doesn't need to be a promotion, because we think of promotions because it comes with higher pay, higher grade, more incentives, etc. Yeah. But if you reward people for what they are great at and keep them where they are, but just increase their package, I think they would be very happy to be there. Again, when it comes to the CTO example that you've given, I think it would happen whether you're in a startup or in a big company as well. I mean, if you are a bad leader, if you can't communicate properly, it's part and parcel of leadership, right? I mean, you will have the skills, but leadership is all about your ability to communicate, to set a vision, to get people inspired and get people working together on a task and to finish a task, etc. So if you can't do that, then obviously you're not supposed to be a leader, right? You could be a subject matter expert and you could be very good at it, but you don't necessarily need to lead people.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic. But why? Because in today's world of diversity and inclusion, and neurodiversity is steadily picking up. There's a lot of stigma around it, right, in organizations, because you get labeled having ADHD, but what do you do with it then? And that's what a lot of bigger companies don't really think about. Like, okay, we want to embrace neurodiversity, but what do we do exactly, and how do we deal with it, and how do we make the work more accessible for you if you're dyslexic? So there are tools to help you make your work more accessible to you. But especially when you are the CTO, right? When you are the person that's the brainchild behind the technology and the innovation that you've been putting into this startup, again, I can imagine that finding.
Okay, well, that's different. So I thought, okay, so if you are a co-founder and a CTO, and you're in that position, then obviously it's slightly different, right? Because people need. I mean, you are a co-founder and you're not going anywhere. But again, if you're an employee and you get promoted somewhere and then you're a bad leader, then obviously you will go, like what happened in the example you mentioned.
Yeah.
If you're a co-founder, it's slightly different, but I think you need to acknowledge and know exactly what you're good at and what you're not good at. And sometimes if you're not good at, motivating people and dealing with people, let's say outside of your technical team, because I think technical people know how to talk to each other very well.
Yeah.
I think usually the disconnect happens when you're trying to explain something technical to a business person or vice versa.
So rounding it up for the discussion today, I would love to ask you, what are your 2 red flags to watch out for in startups, and what are also your 2 green flags to pay attention to when you work in a startup?
On the red flags, I think something that we spoke about during this discussion is the founder dynamics. I think that's very, very important, especially at the stage that we invest at. So we invest very early in the company. Sometimes you have some revenue, sometimes you don't have. You have some traction, but not a lot. So the founder dynamics is very, very important.
What specifically? An example.
So their personal track records. How is the partnership formed, and what is the split basically between them, and how did they come to that decision?
What would be a red flag?
The red flag, if you feel that if they don't speak the same language, if you feel that there's a diversion when it comes to the vision or where they want to take the company, if you feel that from a personal perspective that they disagree, or the way they talk to each other, how they disagree with each other, I think is very important. So you kind of pick up on these little nuances when they're having a discussion.
Right.
Their level of commitment to the startup. Are they doing something else on the side or not? Are they fully committed to this? So I think you pick up on these. Yeah,
those are great examples. I like what you said, like about, are they doing something on the side, or are they fully committed to the job? Mm-hmm. Yeah, because you need to have that passion and energy, like you said before.
Yeah.
And so as for green flags, 2 specific green flags that you think, when I see that's just like, yes.
There's a second red flag.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the first red flag is the founder dynamic, and I think that the second red flag in startup doesn't really have to do with founders at all, but it has to do with how big is the problem that they're solving. Is it really important that, I get my food in 5 minutes versus 15, right? Is it really important that, I don't know, someone is building something that, again, is not a big pain that they're trying to solve? So I think the size of the problem is a reflection on the size of the market. So if that problem is not that big, it means even if they are the best founders, the problem that they are solving is too small, and therefore it's never going to grow.
Okay.
On the green flags, I think again, in early stages, how going back to the founder dynamics and how they are together, their ability to attract a great leadership team. So maybe you look not the top level only, but you look at that second layer as well. Who are they? Where do they come from? Which companies? What's their track record? So I think that's important because that shows to the ability of the founders to attract great people around them and great stakeholders.
And who are passionate enough or like kind of motivated enough to work with their vision that they're selling to them, I guess.
Yes, I mean, if they want you to invest in their company, you want social proof. You want to see that other people are actually fully bought into this. So I'm not the only person who wants to put money in this. There are others. They have a committed team. They have a great team.
Yeah.
And the other thing is like the bias for action, right? So do they sit and debate for months and months, what needs to happen, or they actually go out there and do and test and try and see what's working and what is not working and build on top of that. So that agility, and how they get things done,
right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we call it lean startup, basically. So how fast are you able to iterate and learn from what you're putting out there and building something better?
Excellent.
So that's very important.
So those are your red flags and green flags. So ladies and gentlemen, listening to those, if you're working in a startup, make sure to pay attention to those. Lulu, thank you so much for being in the show today. It was great having. It was an absolute honor to have you here today and share your knowledge with everyone on specifically identifying some of the drama in startups. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Ali.
So in today's podcast, we spoke about red flags and green flags, specifically in the startup environment, because startup environments are becoming ubiquitous, but at the same time, they are very different than your standard corporate environment. And so we can imagine that there are different working styles, there are different ways of how to deal with people, but also, the ego, and as we heard today, the energy and the passion that these, entrepreneurs bring back into the workplace is great, but also can be, fuel for a lot of drama and conflict and misalignment. And so identifying some of those intricacies of startups and entrepreneurs specifically from the environment all the way back to their personal characteristics was something that was a main focus in today's podcast. And of course, I've mentioned it so far also in my post so far, the Red Flags, Green Flags book has now finally come out. And of course, beyond the podcasts and beyond, of course, the TikToks and Reels, in the book, I go so much more deeper into the psychology of work relationships, romance, dating, families, and friends. And we touch upon these topics, but at a much more deeper level. And of course, I provide a lot of frameworks and strategies, practical strategies on how to deal with them effectively. So if you haven't bought the book yet, I definitely recommend you to go out and buy Red Flags, Green Flags, Modern Psychology for Everyday Drama. And I will definitely also put in the links for how you can get in contact with Lulu. Also, information to her own podcast will be provided also down below or wherever this podcast is being published. I'll make sure to have the links there, and so that you can also get in contact with Lulu as well. Thank you for watching today, and see you soon on our next episodes of Red Flags, Green Flags.
Are you ready?